My name is Nicole Pratt, and this is the informative speech for the Fundamentals of Public Speaking, Communications Class 101. It's December in Ukraine's capital, and you're standing in the middle of Independence Square, right in the heart of downtown Kyiv. Even though you're bundled in your warmest clothes, your face and your limbs are still freezing because of the cold temperatures. You jump a little bit in place, hoping to keep warm, because there's no room in any direction to walk. In fact, the greatest warmth that you're getting is from the throngs of people around you. Directly in front of you, there's a long line of tents filled with people who've been camping out for days, even though it's freezing cold. All around you is a sea of orange scarves and flags, and the sound of car horns joins the voices of thousands and thousands of people who are all crying out one man's name, Yushchenko, Yushchenko. This is the overwhelming scene that you would have been a part of had you been a demonstrator in the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine. This was a revolution of politics and of an entire nation that chose to stand up for justice and freedom. I have the privilege of seeing Ukrainian history unfold before my eyes because I was living in Ukraine at the time of this revolution. In addition to my firsthand experience, I've also gathered some information from articles written about the revolution so that I could give you a clear account of this event. I will explain to you that the revolution was an outcry for justice during a presidential election, and I'll give you some of the background that led to this event. I will also give you a description of the demonstrations themselves and tell you about the effects that the Orange Revolution has had on Ukraine. Now let me ask the question that may be on some of your minds. What was the Orange Revolution anyways? The Orange Revolution was a cry against injustice and fraud during the 2004 presidential elections in Ukraine. The main candidates were Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko. These men had extremely different political views, and the Ukrainian people were divided in their support, much like Americans are greatly divided between Democrats and Republicans. After Election Day, there were widespread accusations that Yanukovych's side had committed fraud. Stephen Piper, a senior advisor for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, wrote about this fraud in a November-December 2007 issue of Problems of Post-Communism. He wrote that the acts of fraud included abuse of absentee ballots, ballot stuffing, false voter counts, and denying voters access to polling stations. The result of this fraud was that Yanukovych was unjustly declared president. Because of this corruption, a second election was held on November 21st. This election, too, was proven fraudulent, and in response, masses of Ukrainians filled the streets of Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Now that you have an idea what the revolution was about, I'd like to tell you a little about the background to this fraudulent election. There were two important factors that led to the revolution. One was the division of the Ukrainian people, and the second was differences between the two candidates. Ukraine is a nation that is divided between pro-Western and pro-Russian political supporters. During my years there, I learned that people mostly speak either Russian or Ukrainian, and their loyalties lie either with the West or with Russia. These preferences played an important role in the revolution. The two candidates for presidency held extremely different political views that placed them on opposite sides of this division. Yushchenko was pro-Western, more nationalistic and Ukrainian-speaking. In an article called The Orange Revolution, which appeared in the December 6, 2004 issue of Time magazine, Yushchenko was said to bring Ukraine into the free market world. On the other side was Yanukovych, whose politics leaned towards Russia. He was the Prime Minister of Ukraine under the President Kuchma, who was also pro-Russian. In that same article in Time magazine, it was said that Russian President Putin made two visits during the campaign to show his support for Yanukovych. That same article also said that the presidential election was actually a battle over, and I quote, whether Ukraine would pursue Western-style reforms and closer ties to Europe or stick with state control and a tight relationship with Russia. Now that you've learned about the viewpoints that led to the revolution, I'd like to give you a description of the demonstrations themselves. The demonstrations of the Orange Revolution were massive protests that were surprisingly peaceful. Gerard professor of Russian history at the University of Cologne, and he wrote an article called An Orange-Tinged Revolution, which appeared in the publication Russian Politics and Law. Simon wrote that the demonstrations lasted over 2 weeks, and they involved more than 500,000 people. I remember watching as Independence Square filled with people. They set up tents to sleep in, despite the fact that it was freezing outside. There were orange flags and scarves everywhere, symbolizing the party color of Yushchenko, the pro-Western candidate who had unjustly lost the election. I found a picture on a website called tryukraine.com that demonstrates these protests in Kyiv. Perhaps the most amazing part of these demonstrations was that the protesters did not lash out in violence, as in so many world revolutions in our history. Let's move on now to look at some results that the Orange Revolution has had on Ukraine. There were both practical and symbolic repercussions of this event. Practically speaking, the massive protests proved to the Ukrainian government that fraud and corruption would not be tolerated during this election. Because of the protests, the election was held a third time on December 26th, and this time leading to honest results. The result was that Viktor Yushchenko was named the third president of Ukraine. Symbolically, the Orange Revolution was a victory for freedom and justice for the Ukrainian people. Having lived there myself, I've seen the cost of corruption and the apathy of the people who seem to think their voices did not count. Because of that, I was overjoyed to see 500,000 Ukrainians join together to cry out against wrongdoing. Now that you've seen the results of the Orange Revolution on the Ukrainian people, let's look back on all that I've shared with you today. You have learned that the revolution was an outcry against fraud during a presidential election. You've also learned that there were various causes to this revolution, including the division of the Ukrainian people and the differences in political mindsets of the candidates. I've also given you a description of the demonstrations themselves, and you've learned about the practical and symbolic repercussions of this event. After considering all these things, you might be wondering how this should affect you, unless, of course, you're Ukrainian. I, however, was born an American, but I grew up hearing stories about patriotism, hearing quotes from great men like Patrick Henry, who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." When I moved to Ukraine, I learned that not all the world holds such feelings of national pride and convictions of justice as Americans traditionally do. The Orange Revolution was an important stepping stone for freedom and democracy.